Around 9:21 p.m. on October 24, 2013, Vortex at the North Carolina State Fair was operating normally. The ride was nearing the end of its debut year in the US after operating in Europe since 1997. The ride was just ending its normal cycle and was slowing to a stop. Once the ride stopped, the ride's restraints unlocked and riders began to exit the ride as normal. Seconds later, the ride suddenly restarted. The ride's control booth operator, who was also the foreman of the ride, was signaled by the platform operator to stop the ride, but he panicked and was unable. Meanwhile, the ride flung riders out of the rider vehicles to the ground. Some riders fell nearly the entire height of the ride onto the grated metal floor below as the arms of the ride began to invert. Other riders were able to hold on until the rider vehicles were back in the upright position and they were able to avoid injury. 5 riders total fell from the ride and were seriously injured, with some arriving at the hospital in critical condition. Thankfully, all did survive, though some had lifelong injuries. The investigation into what happened started immediately. The ride's manufacturer had designed a system to prevent the ride from being started with the restraints unlocked. Clearly, this system had failed, but why now? The ride had operated without issue since 1997 in Europe. Why now had this accident suddenly occurred without warning? The answer would turn out to lie with the ride's new American owner. Joshua Macaroni, a now infamous name in the American carnival scene, was new to the traveling rides business in 2013. In order to launch his career in the industry, Joshua bought the Vortex from a European showman between 2012 and 2013, and he partnered with the American showman Family Attractions Amusement. Joshua would transport and maintain the Vortex, while Family Attractions Amusement would book venues and provide a larger variety of rides. This allowed Joshua to exhibit the Vortex at a number of American fairs. The ride made its American debut on March 14, 2013 at the Miami-Dade Youth Fair. When the ride debuted in America, the only noticeable change to the ride was the censored backdrop. Little did anyone know that the ride safety system would soon be greatly compromised. The ride continued to do fairs all across the US, stopping in Indiana, Ohio, Tennessee, Alabama, and North Carolina. The ride was inspected by state inspectors in each state that it operated in. When the ride arrived in North Carolina for the North Carolina State Fair, the ride was first visually looked over by 2 elevator and amusement device state inspectors. The full inspection of the ride began the next day on October 16th, while the ride was still on its 3 transport trailers. The inspectors immediately found a crack in one of the footwells of the passenger vehicles. The crack was in a location that was unlikely to cause a hazard, but North Carolina state law requires that a ride pass 100% of the manufacturer's recommendation for setup, and so the ride would have to be repaired before being certified to operate in the state. Inspectors then watched the ride be assembled. They oversaw the entire building process and saw that it followed manufacturer recommendations. Once the ride was built, state inspectors watched as Joshua and his team started torquing the ride's horizontal arms. The manual required that torquing be applied to the nut and not the bolt. Joshua was torquing the bolt, and state inspectors informed him of this error. Joshua stated that he would need to get another wrench. Joshua returned a few minutes later with a wrench from a different showman who was at the fair and used it to torque the horizontal arms to the manufacturer's standards. The next day, state inspectors returned and found that Joshua had gotten more wrenches of the proper size so that he could torque the other parts of the ride properly. They also found that the ride had been hooked up to a generator at the fairground and that this connection was done properly. Around noon, a certified welder fixed the crack discovered in the footwell the day before. State inspectors then oversaw the testing of the ride's electrical safety system with Joshua Macaroni and his foreman. The ride featured a light called a safety light that was only illuminated when all restraints were down and locked. If this light was not illuminated, the ride would not be able to operate due to a circuit built into the ride's safety system. The state inspectors watched as each restraint was individually raised and the safety light turned off. After this had been proven to be functioning, the state inspectors watched as the ride's e-stop, a button that cuts all power to the ride, stopping it nearly instantly, was tested. They also watched a ride stop and looked at the ride's evacuation procedures. They found everything to be in order. The inspectors next looked at the electrical cabinets for the ride to ensure that everything there was in order. When they opened up one of the cabinets on the ride's decking at the center of the ride, they found a relay that was loose. This was nothing abnormal, as it happens fairly frequently for rides that are transported over the road. Joshua secured the relay and ran a test run to ensure that everything was running properly now that the relay had been put back into place. During this test run, it was noticed that one of the 2 passenger vehicles was not spinning. Joshua remarked to the inspectors that,
"It was working till you made me fix it."
Joshua entered the ride area with his foreman to fix the problem. The inspectors, believing that it would be a quick fix, waited in the ride's control booth as the group went over to the relay cabinet with a screwdriver. The team worked for approximately 10 minutes before returning to the control booth to run another test run. Unbeknownst to the inspectors, Joshua had installed a jumper wire between two connections on the ride that allowed the passenger vehicle to spin again. Joshua had his foreman stand in a spot that blocked the inspector's view of what he was doing. The test run occurred without issue, and the inspectors informed Joshua and his foreman that the ride would be certified for operation. After another test run, the two state inspectors took a test ride. This gave them the chance to notice any issues from a different perspective. No issues were noticed, and after riding the ride, state inspectors issued Joshua and his foreman a certification sticker. In all, it took 2 days to certify the ride for operation. From this point on, Joshua and his foreman were only legally allowed to perform maintenance procedures specified by the ride's manufacturer. After the state inspectors left the ride, Joshua had his staff go on break. Once they came back, he informed them that he had added a jumper wire to allow one of the rider vehicles to spin. This jumper wire also inadvertently overrode the safety light sensors for that side of the ride. The other side of the ride would still give signals to the safety light as normal. However, the jumped out rider vehicle would now always read as locked. Whether Joshua was aware of this when he made the modification is not known. However, this was an illegal modification, as this change was not allowed by the ride's manufacturer. The ride would open at the North Carolina State Fair with this modification in place. For the remainder of the fair, the job of the state inspectors was to rove the fairgrounds and visually inspect rides for any unsafe conditions that may require them to be closed. Daily safety checks would be performed by ride operators at each of the attractions of the fair. These daily safety checks would be completed properly by Vortex's operators for the remainder of the fair. However, these checks were not ride-specific and left some room for interpretation. On October 21st, 3 days before the accident, ride inspectors responded to a mechanical downtime at Vortex. The inspectors were informed by the ride's foreman that during the ride cycle, one of the sensors that detected if restraints were open or closed malfunctioned and sent a signal to the ride's control system that restraints were unlocked during the ride. The ride's control system worked as intended and stopped the ride to prevent any harm. Though no restraints actually came unlocked, the ride did automatically stop in the middle of the ride cycle. This required riders to be evacuated from the ride. After riders were evacuated, the ride's foreman repaired the ride and ran a test cycle for state inspectors. The ride was then reopened. That night, it was discovered that the restraint release button on the ride's control panel had stopped working. To solve this, the ride's operators from now on would open up the control cabinet at the base of the ride and bridge a connection using another jumper wire to unlock restraints at the end of every ride cycle to allow riders to exit. This issue was not reported on the ride's nightly maintenance report. This same issue caused the ride's other rider vehicle to stop spinning as intended. The ride's foreman went to fix this issue the same way Joshua Macaroni had, by installing a jumper wire. This had the unintended effect of the ride's control system now seeing all restraints as locked and secured, regardless of their actual position. Accordingly, the safety light was now always illuminated. The ride's foreman called Joshua the next morning and explained the changes to the ride as well as his reluctance to run the ride in this manner. Joshua told him to continue operating the ride this way regardless, and that he would come look at the ride later. On the 23rd, Joshua arrived to inspect the ride. He looked at the ride and informed the foreman that they would fix the ride at its next location and to continue operation with the jumpers in place. Vortex operated without incident on the 22nd and 23rd. On the night of the 24th, as the ride cycle came to the end, the platform operator entered the ride area and opened up the electrical control cabinet. He bridged the electrical contact using a jumper wire, allowing the restraints to unlock as he had been doing for the past 2 days. As riders began to exit the ride, it started to move again for reasons that are not clear. The passenger vehicles started to invert with riders holding on for life, and others falling to the grated metal floor below, as all restraints were now unlocked. Fairgoers rushed into the ride area to assist the injured. The ride's foreman, who was running the controls for the ride, panicked. He brought the ride to an eventual stop, but did not press the E-stop, which would have immediately stopped the ride. The investigation into the accident started immediately. The ride's foreman, who for the purposes of this video will be called Mr. T, answered questions without much hesitation.
Mr. T, have the lap bars been bypassed?
Yes.
Mr. T, were jumper wires used to accomplish this bypass?
Yes.
Mr. T, were the jumper wires installed in the electrical box at the center of the ride?
Yes.
Mr. T, was there one black and one orange jumper used?
Yes.
Mr. T, did you install these jumpers on your own?
I was told to do it by Josh Macaroni.
The ride's manufacturer was Mel Park of Italy. They had gone out of business in 2000, but many of their employees now worked at Technical Park. A representative from Technical Park was called out to the fair to inspect the ride. He confirmed that the use of jumper wires was not approved and should not have been done. He also discovered that the ride vehicle's restraint indicator lights were removed when the ride came to the US. These were lights located at the back of each section of seats that showed if the restraints in that section were down and locked. The inspector from Technical Park also found that the manufacturer plate for the ride had been forged. The plate stated that the ride was made in 1997 and that it was made by Technical Park, but Technical Park did not exist until 2000. The serial number listed on the plate was also inaccurate. The number listed, 87, corresponded to a different Technical Park ride in Europe. The inspector from Technical Park also found that new electrical diagrams had been added to the ride's manual that were not approved by the manufacturer. The inspector also confirmed that the electrical jumpers placed by Mr. T and Joshua Macaroni bypassed all safety systems on the ride, allowing it to be started with one or all of the restraints open. The final conclusion from the investigation was that the ride's safety restraint system had been bypassed, allowing the ride to operate with unsecured restraints. The ride's foreman, Mr. T, admits to having jumped out the safety system. Joshua Macaroni denies having placed the other jumper in the control cabinet or instructing Mr. T to place a jumper in the control cabinet, though Joshua appears to have had actual knowledge that the safety system was bypassed. Vortex would be sold to another American showman where it would be refurbished and reopened as XXL in 2016. It showed at 3 fairs before being sold to a showman in Mexico. It was never seen showing again, and it's likely the ride has been scrapped. Typically, this is where one of these videos end. However, this accident goes a lot deeper than most. Joshua Macaroni and Mr. T would go through a lengthy legal battle following the accident. Mr. T, who cooperated with investigators and testified against Joshua Macaroni, was sentenced in June 2016. He pleaded guilty to 3 counts of assault with a deadly weapon and was sentenced to 18 months unsupervised probation with an 18 to 34 month suspended sentence. He also served 22 days in jail after being arrested. Mr. T stated after the sentencing that,
"There is absolutely nothing that I can do to change what has happened. It was a horrible event. There's not a day that goes by I don't think about everybody that was involved. And because of not being able to change anything and fix anything that I'd done wrong, I'm truly sorry."
Mr. T would leave the amusement industry and his life after trial is not public. Joshua Macaroni, on the other hand, initially pleaded not guilty to all charges, initially claiming that Mr. T acted alone. After a long legal battle, Joshua Macaroni was charged with felony obstruction of justice for illegally modifying the ride in secret so that it could pass inspection. Joshua was also accused of 3 counts of assault with a deadly weapon. Joshua was sentenced to 30 days in jail as well as 24 months of probation. He also had to pay a fine of over $22,000 in addition to a private settlement with those injured by the ride. But the story doesn't end there. While Mr. T would leave the amusement industry, Joshua Macaroni would not. He went on to buy more rides and show them at fairs around the eastern US. In 2016, a Ferris wheel owned by Joshua Macaroni, operating at a fair in Nashville, Tennessee, had a car seize up and dump 3 riders nearly 30 feet to the ground. The cause was found to be worn-out rivets that allowed a piece of decorative trim to become lodged in the ride, causing the car holding 3 riders to tip. Perhaps this accident is worthy of its own video sometime. In 2018, Joshua Macaroni started a new carnival ride company, Primetime Carnival Co. That same year, the company was hit with a number of OSHA violations at a fair in Alabama. Primetime Carnivals still operate today. In fact, when I was researching Vortex for Flat Ride of the Week back in February, I found out that Primetime Carnival Co. would be at a fair in Ohio, my home state. I did some research and found that a local news station had investigated Joshua Macaroni's history and done a story on his rides coming to the fair. They actually tried calling Joshua's company to ask about their rides and got this response.
You want to talk to us about issues from the past in a negative light? You think that's smart to bring that up at a new fair? Really?
Well, that's what we do. We take a look, we ask the board about it. Would you want to talk about it?
After I heard this, I was left wanting to know more. So I looked on Google Maps and saw that the fair would only be about an hour drive from me. I realized I had to go check it out for myself. So once August 9th rolled around, I grabbed some friends and headed to the fair. So, what were my impressions? Honestly, I can't say anything really stood out as particularly unsafe. The operators of the fair did seem to be pretty disconnected from what was going on with the rides, but mechanically the rides seemed more than fine. Some of the rides were in better shape than others though. They seemed to have some brand new rides like a KMG Freakout and a strange Czech kiddie coaster that both seemed to be very nice and I had no mechanical concerns with. Some of their older rides, particularly the Chance Flying Bobs, looked like they had seen better days, but they never seemed unsafe mechanically. Overall, I'm really torn on how to feel about Joshua Macaroni and his company. Part of me feels like he can be trusted to run a safe carnival. I went to his carnival and I'm still fine. But another part of me remembers that Ohio has some of the strictest ride inspections in the nation, meaning that Joshua's rides could be safe only due to these rules. What's also interesting to me is that more rides were scheduled to be at this fair that ultimately did not show up, such as a rare KMG experience. Was this due to the rides not being able to pass state inspection, or was there a different, more innocent reason? The failed news interview with Primetime Carnival also does not give me hope. Would it be that hard for the company to come out and say, what happened in the past is history, we've grown from that and are committed to that never happening again, or something to that effect? The aggressive and dismissive response the local news station received just seems unnecessary. Ultimately, people like Joshua Macaroni are potentially damaging to the industry. Companies like Bates Bros and Kissel Entertainment have shown that traveling amusement rides can be both safe and thrilling. Careless accidents like those showcased in this video give the traveling amusement ride industry a bad name and reputation. It's my hope that this industry as a whole moves away from its less than safe, good enough attitude that has defined its past. I hope that if Joshua Macaroni or anyone from his company sees this video, they go out of their way to distance themselves from this past by highlighting how safety is a priority at their carnival today. The accidents of the past happened, and they should be acknowledged, not covered up or denied. I would love to see this segment of the industry thrive, and taking steps like this are the best way to a sustainable and safe future.